At 73 years old, I thought I'd weathered every storm life could throw at me. I'd survived my husband's death, raised a son as a single mother, and built a cattle ranch empire across 800 acres of prime Texas land through sheer determination and backbreaking work. The Henderson name meant something in our small town outside Amarillo: respect, integrity, the kind of legacy that gets passed down through generations. Then my son Marcus called on a Wednesday morning and destroyed everything with a single cold sentence. "The farm and properties are in my name now. You're too old to manage them. Everything's mine. You can keep the old house. Nobody wants that falling down relic anyway." The line went dead before I could respond, leaving me staring at the phone like it might explain how my only child had just stolen my entire life's work. I should have screamed, should have called my lawyer, should have fought back with every ounce of fire that had carried me through 7 decades of surviving in a world that didn't always make room for women like me. Instead, I just sat there in the kitchen that suddenly felt too small, too quiet, surrounded by the ghosts of better times and the crushing weight of betrayal. But when I stepped onto the back porch to clear my head, something caught my attention: that loose floorboard I'd been meaning to fix for months. As I knelt down to examine it, the board shifted in a way that felt deliberate, intentional. When I pried it up with my late husband's crowbar, my fingers found the edge of a metal box buried in the red Texas dirt beneath our home's foundation. Inside that box were documents that made my blood run cold. Bank statements showing loans against our properties I'd never authorized. Real estate transfers bearing what looked like my signature, but felt all wrong. And most damning of all, gambling receipts that painted a picture of my son's secret addiction. Hundreds of thousands of dollars lost on poker games, sports bets, and online casinos over the past 2 years. Marcus hadn't betrayed me out of greed. He'd been drowning in debt to dangerous people, using our family properties as collateral for increasingly desperate schemes. The phone call, the cold dismissal. It had all been theater, a performance designed to push me away so I wouldn't get caught in the explosion he could see coming. At the bottom of the box was a letter in Marcus's handwriting, dated 6 months ago. "Mom, if you're reading this, it means something happened to me, or I finally got the courage to tell you the truth." The gambling started small, just weekend games that spiraled into the kind of high-stakes desperation that turns good men into criminals. I used our properties as collateral for loans I never intended to take. Forged your signature on documents I prayed you'd never see. When the bookie started making threats against you, I panicked. "I'm so sorry for what I've done to everything you and Dad built." As I held the evidence of my son's crimes in my weathered hands, I faced an impossible choice. One phone call to the FBI would put Marcus in federal prison for decades, but it would also clear my name and return the properties to my control. Justice served, my legacy protected, and a betrayal answered with the full weight of the law. But 20 minutes later, I heard the sound of Marcus's truck pulling up the gravel drive. He climbed out looking like he'd aged 10 years in a week, hollow-eyed, desperate, carrying himself like a man who'd lost everything that mattered. When he saw me holding his confession letter, he didn't run or make excuses. He just collapsed on the porch steps and told me the truth about the gambling addiction that had consumed his life, the threats against our family, and his desperate attempt to protect me from the consequences of his failures. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he whispered, staring at hands that had forged my signature on documents that could destroy him. "I know what I've done. I know what you have to do now." That moment, watching my son prepare to accept consequences that would end his life as he knew it, taught me something about love that 40 years of marriage and motherhood hadn't quite captured. Sometimes the greatest act of love isn't giving someone what they deserve, but giving them what they need to become who they're meant to be. I could have chosen justice and watched my son disappear into the federal prison system. Instead, I made a choice that would cost me everything I'd worked for, but might, just might, save the only family I had left. The next morning, I walked into First National Bank with evidence that could destroy Marcus and a plan that would sacrifice my entire life's work to give him a second chance. What happened next would test every belief I had about forgiveness, family, and whether redemption is possible when the price of grace is everything you've ever owned. Some truths stay buried for good reason. Others claw their way to the surface when the people we love need them most. This is the story of what I found beneath my floorboards, what it cost me to act on it, and whether choosing mercy over justice can heal a family torn apart by secrets, lies, and the devastating mathematics of unconditional love. I've always believed that a person's character shows most clearly in how they handle their morning routine. For 53 years, I've risen at 5:30 sharp, put the coffee on while the Texas sky was still navy blue, and stepped onto the back porch of our old farmhouse to watch the sun paint the horizon in shades of amber and rose. This morning ritual had carried me through James's death, through Marcus's troubled teenage years, through every crisis that had tested the Henderson family's resolve. But on this particular Wednesday in late October, I found myself standing on that same porch at 5:45, coffee growing cold in my hands, staring not at the sunrise, but at the loose floorboard that had been mocking me for months. The wood was warped from age and weather, one corner lifting just enough to catch my toe whenever I walked across it in my house slippers. James would have fixed it the day it started acting up. He had that kind of methodical attention to detail that made him a good rancher and an even better husband. I'd been meaning to call Bobby Martinez from town to come take a look at it, but something about hiring help for a job I'd watched James do 100 times felt like admitting defeat. At 73, I wasn't ready to wave the white flag on my independence, especially not over a squeaky board. The irony wasn't lost on me now, 24 hours after Marcus's phone call had turned my world upside down. Here I was, fixating on a minor home repair when I'd just lost everything that mattered. 800 acres of prime cattle land, 3 rental properties in downtown Amarillo, and the respect of the only family I had left. Maybe focusing on the floorboard was easier than processing the magnitude of what my son had done to me. I set my coffee cup on the porch railing and knelt down beside the problematic board. The wood felt soft under my fingers, weakened by decades of Texas heat and the occasional flooding that came with spring storms. When I pressed down on one end, the other end lifted like a seesaw, revealing a gap just wide enough for me to slip my fingers underneath. "All right, you stubborn piece of pine," I muttered, channeling the same tone I'd used on uncooperative cattle for 5 decades. "Let's see what you're hiding under there." I went to James's old tool shed. Now my tool shed, I supposed, since it was apparently the only thing Marcus had deemed worthless enough to leave me, and retrieved the crowbar that had served us faithfully through countless farm projects. The weight of it in my hands brought back memories of James teaching Marcus how to pull fence posts, how to pry loose boards from the barn wall, how to apply just enough leverage to get the job done without destroying everything around it. "Gentle but firm," James used to say. "Respect the wood, and it'll respect you back." Back on the porch, I wedged the crowbar under the loose board and applied pressure slowly, the way James had taught me. The nails groaned in protest, but after a few moments of patient coaxing, the entire plank came free with a satisfying crack. What I found underneath stopped me cold. Instead of the dirt and debris I'd expected, there was a rectangular depression in the earth, perfectly sized to hold the metal box that sat nestled within it. The box was about the size of a shoebox, made of heavy steel with a simple latch that had somehow survived years of moisture and shifting soil. It looked deliberate, placed there with intention rather than buried by accident. My heart started hammering against my ribs as I lifted the box from its earthen hiding place. It was heavier than I'd expected, and when I shook it gently, I could hear papers rustling inside along with something else. Something that sounded like smaller metal objects, maybe keys or coins. I carried the box to the kitchen table and sat down with it, suddenly aware that I was about to cross a threshold I might not be able to step back from. In my 73 years, I'd learned that some discoveries change everything, and the smart money said this was one of those moments. The latch opened easily, as if it had been designed to be accessed regularly. Inside, I found a collection of documents that made my blood run cold, and my understanding of the past 2 years shift like tectonic plates. Bank statements in Marcus's name showing loans against our family properties, loans I'd never authorized or even known about. Real estate transfer documents bearing what looked like my signature but felt wrong somehow. The pen strokes too confident, too fluid. A manila envelope labeled Henderson Holdings LLC, containing articles of incorporation for a company I'd never heard of, listing Marcus as president and me as a silent partner. But it was the gambling receipts that made my stomach drop into my shoes. Hundreds of them, from online poker sites, sports betting platforms, and something called Diamond Jack's High Stakes Texas Hold'em Championship. The amount started small, $50 here, $100 there, but escalated quickly into territory that made my pension look like pocket change. $5,000, $10,000, $25,000 on a single football game. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in a plastic bag, was a letter written in Marcus's handwriting. The paper was cheap notebook paper, the kind he'd used for school assignments, and the ink was blue ballpoint pen that had skipped in several places. It was dated 6 months ago. "Mom, if you're reading this, it means something happened to me, or I finally got up the courage to tell you the truth. Either way, I'm sorry. I'm so damn sorry for what I've done to our family, to everything you and Dad built. The gambling started 2 years ago. I thought I was smarter than the odds, thought I could win enough to expand the business, maybe buy back some of the land we lost during the drought. It was going to be a surprise for your birthday. I was going to hand you the deed to the old Morrison place and tell you I'd finally done something to make Dad proud. Instead, I lost everything. And then I lost more. When the bookies started making threats, when they said they'd come after you if I didn't pay up, I panicked. I used our properties as collateral for loans I never intended to take. I forged your signature on documents I prayed you'd never see. I convinced myself it was temporary, that one good week would put everything right. But there's no such thing as one good week in gambling, Mom. There's just the next bet, and the next loss, and the next lie you tell yourself about how you're going to fix it all. I've hidden copies of everything in this box, all the real documents, all the evidence of what I've done. If something happens to me, take it to Ellen Rodriguez at First National. She'll know how to unwind the legal mess I've made. The house is yours free and clear. I made sure of that. It's not much, but it's something. I know you'll never forgive me for this, and I don't expect you to. I just need you to know that every stupid decision I made came from wanting to be worthy of the Henderson name, not from wanting to destroy it. I love you, Mom. I hope someday you can remember that. Marcus. I read the letter 3 times before the words fully sank in. Marcus hadn't betrayed me out of greed or malice. He'd been drowning, making increasingly desperate choices to keep his head above water. The phone call yesterday, the cold dismissal, the claim that he was taking everything because I was too old to manage it. It had all been theater, a performance designed to make me hate him so I wouldn't try to save him. But here was the thing about raising a child for 38 years. You learn to see past their worst moments to the frightened kid underneath. I'd seen this pattern before, during Marcus's teenage years when he'd stolen money from my purse to buy beer for his friends, then picked fights with me to avoid dealing with his guilt. Push me away, make me angry, because disappointment from someone you love hurts worse than hatred from someone who's given up on you. The phone rang, startling me out of my thoughts. For a moment, I thought it might be Marcus calling to apologize, to explain, to somehow make sense of the tornado that had torn through our lives. Instead, I heard the familiar voice of Ellen Rodriguez from First National Bank. Dorothy, I hope I'm not calling too early. I wanted to give you a heads up about some paperwork that came across my desk yesterday. Ellen had been handling the Henderson family's banking for over 20 years. She'd processed the loan when James and I bought our first tractor, had walked me through the mortgage refinancing after his death, had celebrated with me when we finally paid off the original farm loan 5 years ahead of schedule. If anyone in this town understood the blood, sweat, and tears that had built our little empire, it was Ellen Rodriguez. What kind of paperwork, Ellen? Transfer documents for your properties. Marcus came in yesterday afternoon with legal authorization to assume full ownership of the farm and rental properties. Said you'd decided to retire and wanted to simplify your estate planning. Her voice carried a note of concern that made my chest tighten. Dorothy, I have to ask, is this really what you want? Because the timing feels sudden, and frankly, some of the documentation looked what? Well, forgeries aren't my area of expertise, but I've seen your signature enough times to know when something doesn't feel right. The pen pressure was different, and there were some inconsistencies in the letter formation that made me uncomfortable. I closed my eyes and felt the weight of Marcus's letter in my hands. Ellen, I need you to hold off on processing anything until I can come in and review it personally. Can you do that for me? Of course. Dorothy, is everything all right? You sound shaken. I'm fine, honey. Just need to sort through some family business. I'll be in to see you tomorrow morning. After I hung up, I sat in the kitchen surrounded by evidence of my son's desperation and my own naivety. For 2 years, I'd been proud of how well Marcus seemed to be managing his construction business, how he'd started talking about expanding into commercial projects, how he'd insisted on taking over more of the financial management of our properties to give me a break from all the paperwork. I'd thought he was finally stepping into the role of family leader that James had always envisioned for him. Instead, he'd been methodically dismantling everything we'd built, using our assets as gambling chips in a game he could never win. The rational part of my mind knew exactly what I should do. Call the police, report the forgery, let the legal system sort out the mess Marcus had made. He was 38 years old enough to face the consequences of his choices. I'd spent enough years cleaning up after him during his wild 20s. Maybe it was time to let him learn some hard lessons about accountability. But the mother in me, the part that had rocked him through nightmares and cheered at Little League games and held his hand during his father's funeral, couldn't quite bring herself to pick up the phone. This wasn't just about justice or property rights or even the money. This was about whether love could survive the kind of betrayal that cuts all the way to the bone. I spent the rest of the morning walking the property, reacquainting myself with every fence post and creek bed and stand of oak trees that Marcus was apparently prepared to sell out from under me. The cattle looked up from their grazing with mild curiosity as I passed, their big brown eyes reflecting a kind of peaceful contentment that I envied. They didn't worry about betrayal or forgiveness or the complex mathematics of family loyalty. They just ate grass and made more cattle and trusted that someone would keep filling their water troughs. By noon, the October sun had burned off the morning chill, and I found myself standing at the edge of the south pasture where James was buried. We'd chosen this spot not for convenience, but for the view. Rolling hills that stretched to the horizon, broken only by the occasional mesquite tree and the distant silhouette of downtown Amarillo. It was the kind of vista that made you understand why people had fought wars over land like this. "Well, James," I said to the simple granite headstone that bore his name and the inscription, "Beloved husband and father," our boy's gotten himself into quite a mess. I'd been talking to James regularly since his death 12 years ago, usually during my morning walks or when I was working in the garden. I didn't believe in ghosts or spirits or any of that supernatural nonsense, but there was something comforting about sharing my thoughts with someone who'd known Marcus since before he could walk, someone who'd loved him just as fiercely and unconditionally as I did. "He's gambling away everything we worked for, forging my signature on loan documents, and now he's trying to push me away so I won't get hurt when it all comes crashing down." I sat down on the wooden bench Marcus had built next to the grave 5 years ago, back when he still came to visit his father regularly. Part of me wants to turn him in, let him face the consequences. But part of me remembers what you always said about second chances. James had been a firm believer in redemption, even when it seemed impossible. During Marcus's senior year of high school, when our son had been caught selling marijuana to underclassmen, James had refused to let me involve the police. Instead, he'd made Marcus work every afternoon and weekend for 6 months, rebuilding fence lines and mucking out stalls, earning money to pay back every kid who'd bought drugs from him. "A mistake doesn't have to define a man's whole life," James had told me then. "But how he handles the aftermath of that mistake, that'll tell you everything you need to know about his character." Now, sitting in the shadow of his headstone with evidence of Marcus's crimes spread across the kitchen table back at the house, I wondered what James would make of this situation. Was this still the territory of second chances, or had Marcus crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed? The sound of a truck engine interrupted my thoughts. From where I sat, I could see the gravel road that led to our house, and I recognized the blue Ford pickup that was kicking up dust as it approached. Marcus. My heart started pounding again, but this time it wasn't fear or anger. It was something more complicated, a mixture of relief and dread and desperate hope that maybe, somehow, we could find a way through this mess together. I made my way back to the house, taking my time, trying to prepare myself for a conversation I had no idea how to navigate. Through the kitchen window, I could see Marcus pacing on the front porch, running his hands through his hair the way he'd done as a child whenever he was nervous about something. He looked thinner than when I'd last seen him, his face drawn and pale in a way that made me wonder if he'd been sleeping or eating regularly. When I opened the front door, he turned to face me with eyes that looked haunted, defeated. This wasn't the confident businessman who'd called yesterday to inform me that my life was over. This was my little boy, lost and scared and hoping against hope that his mama might still have some magic left to make everything okay. "Mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "we need to talk." I stepped aside to let him into the house, noting how he avoided looking directly at me, how his shoulders seemed to carry the weight of the entire world. "Yes," I said quietly. "I think we do." We sat at the kitchen table with Marcus's letter and the evidence of his crimes spread between us like a roadmap of broken trust. He stared at the documents for a long moment before looking up at me with tears in his eyes. "You found the box." "I did. I never meant for it to go this far, Mom. I swear to you, I thought I could fix it before anyone got hurt." I studied my son's face, searching for traces of the little boy who'd once brought me dandelions and called them flowers, who'd cried when we had to put down his horse, who'd held my hand at his father's funeral and promised me he'd always take care of me. That boy was still there, buried under layers of bad decisions and desperate choices, but still there. "Tell me everything," I said, "from the beginning. And Marcus, no more lies. Not between us." For the next 2 hours, my son told me the story of how a successful construction contractor had become a gambling addict. how small bets had escalated into life-threatening debts, how the fear of disappointing me had driven him to forge my signature rather than ask for help. He cried when he told me about the threats the bookies had made against me, how he'd been trying to protect me the only way he knew how, by pushing me away from the explosion he could see coming. The worst part, he said, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, is that I kept thinking I was one good bet away from fixing everything. One big win, and I could pay back the loans, return the properties to you, and you'd never have to know what kind of man I'd become. What kind of man is that, Marcus? He looked up at me with surprise, as if he'd expected me to answer that question for him. A failure, a liar, a thief who stole from his own mother. I reached across the table and took his hands in mine, noting how soft they'd become now that he wasn't doing manual labor every day, how different they looked from his father's weathered fingers, but how familiar they still felt. "You're my son," I said simply. "That's who you are, and that's who you'll always be, no matter what mistakes you've made. But Mom, the properties are just land and buildings. They can't love me back, can't call me on my birthday, can't give me grandchildren someday." I squeezed his hands tighter. "I spent 50 years building something to leave behind for you, Marcus. I'm not going to let you throw your life away over it." That evening, after Marcus had gone home to face his wife with the truth about their financial situation, I called Ellen Rodriguez and asked her to schedule a meeting for the next morning. I had a plan, but it would require careful execution and more faith than I'd asked of myself in years. As I prepared for bed, I walked out onto the back porch one more time and looked down at the empty hole where Marcus's box had been hidden. Tomorrow, I would start the process of undoing the legal mess he'd created, of working with our lawyer to return the properties to joint ownership, of finding a way to help him restructure his debts without destroying his construction business entirely. It wouldn't be easy. There would be difficult conversations with banks, maybe with law enforcement, certainly with family friends who would wonder how Dorothy Henderson could have been so blind to her son's problems. But as I stood there under the vast Texas sky, surrounded by land that had sustained 3 generations of my family, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. The floorboard that had started this whole journey lay propped against the porch railing, waiting to be reinstalled once I figured out what to do with the space underneath it. Maybe I'd fill it with concrete, seal away the hiding place that had kept Marcus's secrets for so long. Or maybe I'd leave it empty, a reminder that the most important truths aren't always buried. Sometimes they're right there on the surface, waiting for someone brave enough to face them. Either way, tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities for redemption. Tonight, I was content to stand on my porch, in my house, on my land, knowing that some things, love, family, the stubborn hope that broken people can heal, are worth more than any property deed could ever represent. The foundation of our family had cracked, but it hadn't crumbled. And with enough time, patience, and grace, maybe we could rebuild something even stronger from the pieces that remained. The morning of my meeting with Ellen Rodriguez dawned gray and overcast, the kind of October sky that promised rain by evening. I'd been awake since 4, pacing the kitchen with my 3rd cup of coffee, rehearsing conversations and preparing for questions I wasn't sure I could answer. The documents from Marcus's hidden box were organized in a manila folder on the passenger seat of my pickup truck, each piece of evidence a small bomb waiting to explode my son's life. I arrived at First National Bank 15 minutes early, which gave me time to sit in the parking lot and watch the morning routine of downtown Amarillo unfold around me. Business owners unlocking their shops, early commuters grabbing coffee from the drive-thru across the street, a group of construction workers, not Marcus's crew, I noted with relief, discussing their day over breakfast sandwiches. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that Dorothy Henderson was about to make decisions that would ripple through the community like stones thrown into still water. Ellen met me at the door of the bank with the kind of gentle smile that told me she'd already guessed this wasn't going to be a routine conversation. She'd aged gracefully in the 20-plus years I'd known her, her black hair now streaked with silver but her eyes still sharp with the intelligence that had made her one of the most respected bankers in the Texas Panhandle. "Dorothy, you look tired," she said, leading me to her office. "Can I get you some coffee?" "I'm fine, honey. Let's just get this sorted out." Ellen's office was a testament to her roots in the community. Framed photos of local high school graduations she'd sponsored, thank you cards from families whose first homes she'd helped finance, and a collection of ceramic horses that reflected her passion for quarter horse breeding. On her desk, I could see the documents Marcus had brought in, marked with sticky notes and paper clips in a way that suggested she'd been studying them carefully. "Before we dive into the legal paperwork," Ellen said, settling into her chair, "I want you to know that whatever's going on with Marcus, We'll figure out a way to protect your interests. You've been part of this community too long to get blindsided by financial problems. I opened my folder and spread Marcus's confession letter across her desk, followed by the real estate documents, bank statements, and gambling receipts I'd found in the buried box. Ellen's expression shifted from concern to shock to something approaching professional outrage as she scanned the evidence. Jesus, Dorothy, how long has this been going on? About 2 years, according to Marcus. He came clean with me yesterday evening after I found all this buried under the floorboards of our back porch. I managed a weak smile. Apparently, my son has been using our family properties as his personal piggy bank, while I was worrying about loose boards and cattle feed. Ellen picked up one of the loan documents and held it up to the light, studying the signature with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen her share of forgeries. This is definitely not your handwriting. The pressure is all wrong, and look here. She pointed to the way my name was signed. You always connect the D in Dorothy to the O with a little flourish. This signature has a clean break between the letters. So what does that mean, legally speaking? It means Marcus committed bank fraud, possibly at multiple institutions. The loans he took out using forged documents are invalid, which should protect your properties from seizure. But Dorothy, she paused, choosing her words carefully. This isn't something we can just sweep under the rug. The amounts involved are significant enough to trigger federal interest if the banks decide to press charges. I'd been preparing myself for this moment since finding the box, but hearing it spoken aloud still felt like a physical blow. What are my options? Well, we can approach this several ways. The most straightforward path would be to report the forgeries to the authorities and let law enforcement handle it. That would clear you of any legal responsibility and probably result in the loans being nullified. And Marcus? Ellen's expression softened. Would likely face federal charges for bank fraud. Given the amounts and the duration of the scheme, he'd probably be looking at significant prison time. I stared out the window at the courthouse square where Marcus had played as a child while I conducted business, where he'd learned to ride his bicycle on summer afternoons, where we'd attended 4th of July celebrations and Christmas tree lightings for 38 years. The idea of him sitting in a federal prison cell while life continued on in the town where he'd grown up seemed impossibly cruel. What's the other way? We could approach the banks privately, present the evidence of forgery, and work out repayment agreements that wouldn't involve criminal charges. It would be expensive and it would take time, but it might allow Marcus to keep his construction business and his freedom. How expensive? Ellen pulled out a calculator and started adding numbers from the various loan documents. The total made my stomach clench with anxiety. More money than I'd ever imagined having, let alone owing. But it wasn't insurmountable, especially if we were able to use the properties as legitimate collateral for a restructured loan. It would mean mortgaging everything, the farm, the rental properties, probably taking out a personal loan against your retirement savings. You'd essentially be starting over financially at 73. I thought about James and the 40 years we'd spent building our little empire from nothing, about the dreams we'd shared for leaving something substantial behind for Marcus and his future children. All of that work, all those sacrifices, reduced to a number on a bank statement and a monthly payment that would last until I died. But Marcus would be free to rebuild his life. If he can stay away from gambling and focus on his construction business, yes. But Dorothy, that's a big if. Addiction doesn't just go away because the consequences get more severe. I spent the next hour going through the details of each forged loan, understanding how Marcus had used our properties as collateral for increasingly desperate bets. The pattern was heartbreakingly predictable. Small loans at first, paid back quickly to establish trust, then larger amounts as his gambling debts mounted and his ability to repay deteriorated. The most damaging document was a business loan he'd taken out 6 months ago, using the entire farm as collateral for a construction project that had never existed. The money had gone directly to an offshore gambling site that specialized in high-stakes poker tournaments. Marcus had lost it all in a single weekend. He was trying to win enough to pay back everything else, I murmured, reading through the transaction records. One big score to make it all go away. That's how gambling addiction works, Ellen said gently. The next bet is always going to be the one that fixes everything. By the time we finished reviewing the documents, it was nearly noon, and I felt emotionally drained in a way that reminded me of the weeks following James's funeral. That same sense of unreality, of having to make life-altering decisions while feeling like I was watching someone else's life unfold. I need some time to think about this, I told Ellen. Can you hold off on processing any of the transfer documents until I decide how to handle the situation? Of course, but Dorothy, don't take too long. The longer these forged loans remain in place, the more complicated it becomes to unwind them. I drove home through streets that suddenly felt different, like I was seeing my town through the eyes of someone who might have to leave it. The Henderson farm had been in our family for 3 generations. Would I be the one to lose it all because I'd trusted my son too much and watched him too little? Marcus's pickup truck was parked in my driveway when I arrived home, and I found him sitting on the front porch steps with his head in his hands. He looked up when he heard my truck, and I could see he'd been crying. "Mom, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about not letting me throw my life away over the properties." He stood up slowly, like an old man despite being only 38. "Maybe it's time I face the consequences of what I've done." "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe I should turn myself in. Call the FBI, tell them everything. Let them sort out the legal mess I've made. You shouldn't have to sacrifice everything you've worked for just because your son is a screw-up." I sat down on the porch steps and patted the space next to me. Marcus settled beside me with a heavy sigh, and for a moment we just sat there watching the clouds build on the horizon. "Tell me about Sarah," I said quietly. Sarah was Marcus's wife of 8 years, a sweet woman who taught 3rd grade at the elementary school where Marcus had once been a student. They'd been trying to have children for the past 3 years, a struggle that I suspected had added to the stress that drove Marcus to gambling. She knows everything now. About the gambling, the loans, all of it. His voice cracked slightly. "She's staying with her sister while she decides whether our marriage is worth saving. Do you think it is?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. "I don't know, Mom. I've lied to her so many times over the past 2 years. Every time she asked about money, about why I was working late, about why I seemed stressed all the time. I looked her in the eye and lied, over and over again. But do you love her?" "More than anything. But I'm not sure love is enough to overcome the kind of betrayal I've put her through." I thought about James and the early years of our marriage when money was tight and disagreements were frequent. There had been times when love felt fragile, when the gap between who we thought we were and who we actually were seemed too wide to bridge. But somehow we'd found ways to forgive each other's failures and build something stronger from the broken pieces. "Love isn't enough by itself," I said finally, "but it's a good foundation to build on if you're willing to do the work." "What kind of work?" "The kind that requires you to become the man Sarah fell in love with, instead of the man you've been pretending to be." We spent the rest of the afternoon talking about practical matters: how to approach the banks, how to restructure his construction business, how to find a gambling addiction counselor who could help him understand why he'd made the choices that led to this moment. It felt like planning a battle campaign, complete with strategies and fallback positions and contingency plans for when everything went wrong. That evening, I called Sarah and asked her to come over for dinner. She arrived looking exhausted and wary, her usually bright demeanor dimmed by the weight of her husband's revelations. Over pot roast and mashed potatoes, comfort food seemed appropriate for the conversation we needed to have. I told her about the buried box, the evidence of Marcus's desperation, and the choice I was facing between justice and mercy. "I don't expect you to forgive him right away," I said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "But I want you to know that Marcus's gambling addiction doesn't define who he is as a person, any more than James's tendency to drink too much during cattle drives defined him." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "But Dorothy, he lied to me for 2 years. Every day. Every conversation about our future, our plans to start a family, it was all built on lies." "Yes, it was. And that's something he'll have to live with for the rest of his life. But the question isn't whether he lied to you, Sarah. The question is whether you believe he can become the kind of man who won't lie to you anymore. How can I possibly trust him again?" "You start small," I said, thinking about my own journey of learning to trust Marcus with farm responsibilities after his teenage mistakes. "You set boundaries, you verify what he tells you, and you give him opportunities to prove that he's changed. It's not about blind faith. It's about earned trust, built one honest conversation at a time." After Sarah left, promising to think about what I'd said, I found myself alone with the biggest decision of my adult life. I could protect my financial security and let Marcus face the legal consequences of his actions, or I could risk everything I'd worked for on the possibility that people can change, that love can overcome betrayal, that redemption is always possible if someone wants it badly enough. I walked out to James's grave as the sun was setting, painting the Texas sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded me of the morning I discovered the loose floorboard. The wooden bench Marcus had built was weathered now, but still solid, still capable of supporting weight. "I know what you'd tell me to do," I said to the headstone. "You'd say that family is more important than property, that love is more valuable than land. But James, what if I'm wrong about him? What if I sacrifice everything and he just goes back to gambling? The wind picked up, rustling the mesquite trees and carrying the scent of rain from the approaching storm. I sat there until full darkness fell, weighing the accumulated wisdom of 73 years against the terrible uncertainty of the future. When I finally walked back to the house, I knew what I had to do. It wasn't the safe choice or the smart choice or even the choice that most people would make in my situation. But it was the choice that felt right in my bones. The choice that honored the kind of love James and I had tried to build our family on. The next morning, I called Ellen Rodriguez and told her to schedule meetings with all the banks involved in Marcus's forged loans. I was going to mortgage everything I owned to clean up my son's mistakes, not because he deserved it, but because sometimes the most profound act of love is believing in someone's capacity for redemption, even when they've lost faith in themselves. It would take months to unravel the financial mess, years to pay off the restructured loans, and probably the rest of my life to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. But as I hung up the phone and looked around the kitchen where 3 generations of my family had shared meals and made memories, I felt something I hadn't experienced in days: peace. The floorboard on the back porch was still propped against the railing, waiting to be reinstalled. Tonight, after Marcus came over to help me figure out how to tell our extended family about the situation, I would nail it back into place. The hiding spot beneath it would remain empty. No more buried secrets. No more desperate attempts to protect each other from the truth. Whatever came next, we would face it together, in the light of day, with all our flaws and failures exposed, but our love for each other intact. That seemed like a foundation strong enough to build a new future on, even if it looked nothing like the one James and I had originally imagined. The first bank meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock on a Monday morning in early November, and I woke up that day feeling like I was preparing for my own execution. I'd spent the weekend going over the numbers with Marcus, understanding exactly how much of my life's work I was about to sacrifice on the altar of unconditional love. The farm would be mortgaged to the hilt, the rental properties leveraged beyond anything I'd ever imagined, and my retirement savings would become collateral for loans that would take me well into my 80s to repay, assuming I lived that long. Marcus had offered multiple times to turn himself in rather than let me make this sacrifice. Each time I'd looked at my son, really looked at him, past the mistakes and the addiction and the fear that had driven him to such desperate measures, and seen the little boy who used to bring me wildflowers and promise that he'd always take care of me. Maybe this was my way of taking care of him instead. Ellen Rodriguez had arranged for us to meet with representatives from all 3 banks involved in Marcus's forged loans. The plan was elegant in its simplicity: present evidence of the forgeries, negotiate repayment terms that would satisfy the banks without involving law enforcement, and restructure everything under legitimate loans that I would personally guarantee. It would cost me everything I'd built, but it would give Marcus a chance to rebuild his life without a federal prison sentence hanging over his head. The meeting was held in the conference room at First National, a space I'd been in countless times over the years for routine business transactions. Today, it felt like a courtroom where I was about to plead guilty to someone else's crimes. Present were Ellen Rodriguez, myself, Marcus, our family lawyer Robert Chen, and 3 bankers representing the institutions where Marcus had committed fraud. The evidence was spread across the polished conference table like autopsy photos: loan documents, forged signatures, gambling receipts, bank statements showing the systematic destruction of our family's financial security. "Before we begin," said Patricia Wells from Panhandle First Bank, "I want to make sure everyone understands the seriousness of what we're discussing here. Mr. Henderson has committed multiple felonies across state lines. The normal protocol would be to refer this matter to federal authorities." Robert Chen, our lawyer, leaned forward slightly, "which is why we're proposing an alternative that serves everyone's interests. Mrs. Henderson is prepared to make full restitution for all fraudulent loans, plus interest and penalties, in exchange for agreements not to pursue criminal charges." "What kind of restitution are we talking about?" asked Michael Torres from Southwest Commerce Bank. Ellen slid a folder across the table containing financial statements that laid bare the entirety of my assets: property valuations, retirement account balances, projected income from Social Security, and the small pension James had left me. It was my entire life reduced to numbers on a spreadsheet, and seeing it all laid out that way made me feel naked and vulnerable in a way I hadn't experienced since James's death. "Mrs. Henderson is proposing to secure new legitimate loans against her properties to cover the full amount of the fraudulent debt," Ellen explained. "The farms and rental properties have been appraised at values significantly higher than the outstanding loan amounts." Patricia Wells studied the documents with the kind of meticulous attention that had probably made her successful in banking. This would essentially transfer all debt from Marcus Henderson to Dorothy Henderson, correct? That's correct, Robert said. And what assurances do we have that Marcus won't simply repeat this behavior in the future? I'd been dreading this question because I knew it was the one I couldn't answer with absolute certainty. Marcus had promised me he would seek treatment for his gambling addiction, had sworn he would never touch another bet for the rest of his life, had looked me in the eyes with tears streaming down his face and begged me to believe that he could change. But promises from gambling addicts weren't exactly known for their reliability. Marcus will be entering a residential treatment program for gambling addiction, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He'll also be turning over all financial management of his construction business to a certified accountant with monthly reports provided to me as part of our family's oversight. And if he relapses? Marcus spoke for the first time since the meeting began, his voice barely above a whisper. If I ever gamble again, I'll turn myself in to federal authorities. I'll confess to everything and accept whatever sentence they give me. The room fell silent for a moment as everyone processed the weight of what he'd just said. I reached over and took his hand, noting how it trembled slightly in mine. The negotiations took 3 hours and felt like the longest morning of my life. Each bank wanted slightly different terms, different interest rates, different penalty clauses. Robert Chen earned every penny of his fee that day, finding ways to structure the agreements that protected the bank's interests, while still leaving me with enough income to survive month to month. When we finally reached consensus, I signed my name to documents that would define the rest of my life. My signature, my real signature, not a forgery, appeared on loan papers totaling more money than I'd ever imagined owing anyone. The interest payments alone would consume most of my Social Security income, leaving me dependent on the small profit from Marcus's construction business and whatever rent I could collect from the properties. There's one more thing, Patricia Wells said as we were preparing to leave. We'll need Mr. Henderson to undergo periodic financial auditing for the next 5 years. Any unexplained income or expenses will trigger a review of these agreements. Marcus nodded without hesitation. Whatever you need. As we walked out of the bank, I felt simultaneously relieved and terrified. The immediate crisis was over. Marcus wouldn't be going to prison, the properties wouldn't be seized, and our family name wouldn't be dragged through the local newspapers. But I'd essentially mortgaged my future on the hope that my son could overcome an addiction that had already destroyed so much. Mom, Marcus said as we reached our trucks in the parking lot, I don't know how to thank you for what you just did. You can thank me by becoming the man your father always believed you could be, I replied. And Marcus, this is the last time. If you gamble again, if you lie to me again, if you put our family through anything like this again, I won't be able to help you. Not because I won't want to, but because there won't be anything left to help with. He nodded, understanding the weight of what I was saying. I know, Mom. I won't let you down again. The next few weeks passed in a blur of paperwork and painful conversations. Word had gotten around town, as word always does in small communities, that the Henderson family was going through some financial difficulties. People were kind but curious, offering help while fishing for details about what had happened to the family that had always seemed so stable and successful. I found myself having the same conversation over and over again. Yes, we were restructuring some loans. No, we weren't losing the farm. Marcus was going through a difficult time, but was getting help. Each conversation felt like a small betrayal of the privacy James and I had always valued, but I understood that explanations were necessary to prevent rumors from becoming even more damaging than the truth. Sarah came by the house one evening in late November, looking more hopeful than I'd seen her since Marcus's confession. She'd been meeting with a counselor who specialized in relationships affected by addiction, learning how to rebuild trust while protecting herself from future betrayals. I've decided to give our marriage another chance, she told me over coffee in the kitchen where so many important family conversations had taken place. But it's going to look very different from what we had before. How so? Complete financial transparency. I'll have access to all accounts, all business records, all credit reports. Marcus has agreed to attend Gamblers Anonymous meetings twice a week for the foreseeable future, and will be seeing a marriage counselor monthly. I nodded approvingly. That sounds like a smart approach. Trust but verify, as they say. The thing is, Dorothy, I'm not sure I would have been strong enough to take this risk if I hadn't seen you do it first. Watching you sacrifice everything to give Marcus a second chance made me realize that love isn't just about forgiveness. It's about believing that people can change, even when all the evidence suggests they won't. 2 weeks later, Marcus entered a 30-day residential treatment program in Dallas. The night before he left, he came to the house for dinner, and we sat on the back porch talking until well past midnight. The floorboard had been permanently repaired, the hiding place filled with concrete and sealed over. No more buried secrets. "I keep thinking about Dad," Marcus said, staring out at the dark pasture where James was buried. "About how disappointed he would be in what I've done to our family. Your father made plenty of mistakes when he was your age," I said gently. "The difference is that he learned from them and spent the rest of his life trying to be worthy of the second chances he received. Do you really think I can do that? Become someone worthy of the sacrifice you've made?" I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw not just the broken man who'd gambled away our family's legacy, but also the potential for who he might become. "I think you can become whoever you decide to be, Marcus. The question is, who do you want to be?" The treatment program was intensive and brutal, forcing Marcus to confront not just his gambling addiction, but the underlying emotional issues that had made him vulnerable to it in the first place. He called me every few days, and I could hear something changing in his voice, a clarity that had been missing for years, a sense of hope that maybe redemption was possible. Meanwhile, I was learning to live within the constraints of my new financial reality. The mortgage payments were substantial, leaving little room for extras, but I found unexpected satisfaction in returning to the kind of careful budgeting that had characterized the early years of my marriage. There was something liberating about knowing exactly where every dollar was going, about having a clear purpose for the sacrifices I was making. The hardest part was the loneliness. For the first time in my adult life, I was truly alone. No husband to share the daily burdens of farm life, no son dropping by with grandchildren or plans for Sunday dinner. Some evenings, the silence in the house was so complete that I found myself talking to James's photograph just to hear a human voice, even if it was only my own. But gradually, I began to find a rhythm in this new life. I joined the Methodist Church's quilting circle, started volunteering at the local food bank, and even took up watercolor painting at the community center. These weren't activities I'd ever had time for during the busy years of building and maintaining our family's prosperity, but they gave me a sense of connection to the community that felt deeper and more meaningful than the relationships built around business transactions. Marcus completed his treatment program just before Christmas and returned home looking like a different person. The haunted, desperate expression was gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine peace. He'd gained some healthy weight, his color was better, and for the first time in years, he could look me directly in the eyes when we spoke. "I understand now why I started gambling," he told me on Christmas morning as we sat by the tree that Sarah had helped me decorate. "It wasn't really about the money or the thrill of winning. It was about trying to prove that I was worthy of the legacy you and Dad built, that I could be the kind of man who deserved to inherit something so valuable. And now I understand that I can't inherit worth. I have to earn it. Every day, with every choice I make, with how I treat my wife and my business and my community." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I know I may never fully earn back what I've cost us, Mom, but I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying." That afternoon, Sarah joined us for Christmas dinner, tentatively but genuinely reconnecting with the family she'd almost lost. As we sat around the table where 4 generations of Hendersons had celebrated holidays, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: hope for the future. The construction business had survived Marcus's absence better than expected, thanks to his foreman's competent management and the loyalty of clients who'd known our family for years. With the new financial oversight in place, Marcus was able to return to work while maintaining the transparency that his recovery required. But the real test came on a cold February evening when Marcus called me, his voice shaking with something that sounded like panic. "Mom, I need to come over. Something happened today, and I need help." He arrived 30 minutes later, pale and visibly agitated. We sat in the kitchen while he told me about the day's events. A major construction project had fallen through due to a client's bankruptcy, leaving Marcus's business with a significant cash flow problem. The old Marcus might have seen this as justification for just one bet to solve the immediate crisis. "The thoughts came back," he admitted, staring at his hands. "For about an hour today, all I could think about was how quickly I could win enough money to cover the shortfall. I even started calculating odds in my head, remembering the names of online sites I used to use." "But you didn't gamble." "No. Instead, I called my sponsor. Then I called Sarah. Then I drove straight here. Because I remembered what you taught me about the difference between having thoughts and acting on them. We spent the evening working through practical solutions to his business problem, restructuring payment schedules, securing a small business loan through legitimate channels, temporarily reducing his salary to preserve cash flow. It was the kind of problem-solving conversation we should have been having all along, instead of the desperate secrecy that had nearly destroyed our family. "This is what recovery looks like," I told him as he prepared to leave. "Not the absence of temptation, but the presence of better choices when temptation comes." Spring brought new challenges and new growth. Sarah announced she was pregnant, news that filled me with the kind of joy I hadn't felt since before James's death. The baby would be born in October, exactly 1 year after I'd discovered the buried box that had changed all our lives. As I worked in my garden one warm April evening, planting tomatoes and peppers that would feed my growing family, I reflected on the year that had passed. I'd lost most of my financial security, but gained something more valuable: the knowledge that love can survive betrayal, that families can heal from even the deepest wounds, and that sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone is the chance to become better than they are. The farm was no longer mine in the way it had been for 50 years, but it was still home to people I loved, still the foundation on which new generations would build their lives. The properties that had once represented my legacy were now symbols of something different, proof that grace can triumph over justice when love provides the courage to take that leap of faith. Marcus had been right about one thing in his desperate letter. The Henderson name did mean something in this community. But its value wasn't measured in acres owned or bank accounts maintained. It was measured in the willingness to sacrifice for others, to believe in redemption when redemption seemed impossible, and to choose love over self-protection even when the cost was everything you'd worked for. As the sun set over the Texas plains, painting the sky in the same shades of orange and pink I'd watched every morning for 73 years, I felt the kind of deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you've lived according to your values, even when those values demanded everything you had to give. The floorboard on the back porch was solid now, no longer hiding secrets or harboring shame. Beneath it lay only concrete and earth, the foundation upon which our family would continue to build, one honest conversation at a time, one day of recovery at a time, one act of love at a time. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be mortgage payments and sleepless nights, difficult conversations and moments of doubt. But tonight, I was content to sit on my porch, in my house, on my land, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived and a family slowly healing from its deepest wounds. The buried truth had been uncovered, examined, and ultimately transformed into something that looked surprisingly like hope. October arrived like a gentle whisper of redemption, exactly 1 year after I'd knelt on my back porch and discovered the buried box that would reshape our family's entire future. The leaves on the mesquite trees were turning golden. The morning air carried the crisp promise of winter, and Sarah was in her final weeks of pregnancy, her belly round with the grandchild I'd almost lost the chance to know. I woke up early that morning, as I had every day for 7 decades, but instead of feeling the weight of financial anxiety that had characterized the past year, I felt something lighter. Not quite contentment, but perhaps its distant cousin, acceptance. The mortgage payments were manageable now that Marcus's construction business had stabilized, and I discovered that living with less money didn't necessarily mean living with less joy. Marcus arrived at 7:30 with fresh coffee and a box of kolaches from the Czech bakery in town, our new Thursday morning tradition. These weekly visits had become sacred time for us, opportunities to practice the kind of honest communication that might have prevented the crisis that had nearly destroyed our family. "Sarah had contractions again last night," he said, settling into the kitchen chair that had been his since childhood. "False alarm, but we're getting close." I studied my son's face, marveling at how much he'd changed in the 12 months since his confession. The haunted, desperate expression was gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine peace. He'd gained healthy weight, his posture was straighter, and most importantly, he could look me directly in the eyes when we spoke, something he hadn't been able to do for years before his recovery. "How are you feeling about becoming a father?" I asked, pouring myself coffee from the pot he'd brought. "Terrified," he said with a laugh that held more joy than fear, but also grateful. "A year ago, I thought I'd destroyed any chance Sarah and I had for a future together. Now we're about to bring a new life into the world. Your father was terrified too when you were born. He spent the entire drive to the hospital convinced he was going to drop you or forget to feed you or somehow mess up the most important job he'd ever had." Marcus smiled at that. "Did he ever tell you about the day he realized he was ready to be a dad?" "No, he never mentioned that." It was when I was about 6 months old and I got sick with a fever that wouldn't break. He stayed up with me all night, walking the floors, singing off-key lullabies, checking my temperature every 15 minutes. He told me later that sometime around 4 in the morning, he realized he would have gladly traded places with me, taken on the illness himself if it meant keeping me safe. That's when he knew he was a father, not just biologically, but in his heart. I felt tears prick at my eyes, thinking about James and the countless nights he'd sacrificed his own comfort for our family's well-being. That sounds like your father. He had a gift for understanding what love actually looked like in practice, not just in theory. I think about that story a lot now, Marcus continued, his voice growing thoughtful, about the difference between being responsible for someone and being responsible to someone. The gambling, the lying, the forged signatures, all of that came from me thinking I was responsible for fixing everything, for being worthy of the Henderson name. But I was never responsible to you and Dad, never honest about my struggles or humble enough to ask for help. This was the kind of insight that had emerged from his treatment program and ongoing therapy sessions. Marcus had learned to articulate the difference between shame and guilt, between perfectionism and excellence, between protecting people from truth and protecting them through truth. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick, but it had been thorough. Speaking of responsibility, I said, pulling out a folder I'd been preparing for this conversation, I have something to discuss with you. Inside the folder were legal documents I'd had Robert Chen prepare, papers that would gradually transfer ownership of the properties back to Marcus over the next 10 years, contingent on his continued recovery and financial transparency. It wasn't a gift or an act of charity, but rather a structured path for him to earn back what he'd nearly lost. "Mom, I can't accept this," Marcus said after reading through the documents. "You sacrificed everything to clean up my mistakes. These properties should be yours for the rest of your life." "They will be mine for the rest of my life," I said gently. "But they'll also be yours, and eventually your child's." This isn't about forgiveness, Marcus. It's about trust, the kind that's earned slowly and demonstrated consistently. The transfer plan included built-in safeguards, monthly financial reports, ongoing therapy requirements, and automatic reversals if Marcus showed any signs of returning to gambling. It wasn't unconditional love so much as conditional opportunity, a framework that would allow our family to rebuild while protecting against future betrayals. "There's one more thing," I said, reaching into the folder for a smaller envelope. "This is from your father." Marcus's eyes widened with confusion. "What do you mean?" "James wrote letters to you throughout your childhood, one for each year from birth through 18. He planned to give them to you on your wedding day, but..." I paused, remembering the cruel swiftness with which cancer had taken my husband. After he died, I found them in his desk drawer. I've been waiting for the right moment to share them. The letter I handed Marcus was labeled age 38 in James's careful handwriting. My husband had apparently planned to write letters corresponding to major life milestones, though he'd only completed a few before his illness made such long-term planning impossible. Marcus's hands shook slightly as he opened the envelope and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. I could see James's words written in the blue ink he'd preferred for important documents. "My dear son, if you're reading this letter, it means I'm no longer with you to share whatever wisdom I might have gained in my years on this earth. I hope that by age 38, you've learned some of the lessons that took me far too long to understand. The most important of these is that a man's worth isn't measured by what he accumulates or achieves, but by how he treats the people who love him when he's at his worst. I made plenty of mistakes during my marriage to your mother, spent money we didn't have on farming equipment I was convinced we needed, drank too much during cattle drives, let my pride get in the way of asking for help when times were tough. But your mother chose to see who I could become rather than judge me for who I was in my weakest moments. That gift, the gift of being believed in even when you don't believe in yourself, is the foundation of everything good in my life. If you're struggling when you read this, if you've made choices you regret or hurt people you love, remember that redemption is always possible for those willing to do the work. Your mother will teach you about grace if you let her. Listen to her, son. She's wiser than both of us. All my love." Dad Marcus finished reading and set the letter down with tears streaming down his cheeks. For several minutes, we sat in silence, processing the strange timing of James's words and their relevance to our current situation. "It's like he knew," Marcus finally whispered, "like he knew exactly what I would need to hear." "Your father understood human nature," I said softly. "He knew that most people struggle with the same fundamental challenges: pride, fear, the difficulty of asking for help when we need it most. He just had a gift for seeing the potential in people, even when they couldn't see it themselves. That afternoon, Sarah went into labor 3 weeks ahead of schedule, sending Marcus into the kind of controlled panic that reminded me of James during my own pregnancy. I drove them to the hospital in Amarillo, Marcus gripping Sarah's hand in the backseat while she breathed through contractions with the focused intensity of someone who'd been preparing for this moment for months. The labor was long but uncomplicated, and at 11:47 p.m. on October 15th, my granddaughter entered the world with a cry that could have awakened the entire maternity ward. Emma Rose Henderson, named for both her grandmothers, weighed 6 pounds, 3 ounces, and had the kind of perfectly formed features that made everyone in the room momentarily forget the pain and exhaustion of the past 18 hours. I held her for the first time in the quiet moments after the medical staff had finished their examinations, marveling at the weight of new life in my arms. She was so small, so completely dependent on the adults around her, yet somehow she represented the future of our family in a way that felt both fragile and indestructible. "Look at her," Sarah whispered from her hospital bed, exhausted but radiant. "She's perfect. She's a Henderson," Marcus said with wonder in his voice, gently touching one tiny fist. "She's got Dad's stubborn chin." As I looked at this newest member of our family, I thought about the year that had passed since discovering the buried box. We'd lost a fortune in money, but gained something more valuable: the knowledge that love can survive betrayal, that families can heal from the deepest wounds, and that sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone is the chance to become better than they are. The hospital room was quiet except for the soft beeping of monitors and Emma's occasional sigh. Outside the window, I could see the lights of Amarillo spreading across the Texas plains, the same landscape that had sustained our family for 3 generations. Tomorrow, we would take this little girl home to the farm where her grandfather was buried, where her father had learned to ride horses and drive tractors, where her great-grandmother had first put down roots in soil that would nurture 4 generations of Hendersons. 2 weeks later, on a crisp November morning, we held a ceremony of sorts in the pasture where James was buried. It wasn't a religious service exactly, but rather a family gathering to introduce Emma to her grandfather and to mark the completion of our first year of recovery. Marcus read aloud from the letter James had written him, sharing his father's words about redemption and grace with the Texas sky as witness. Sarah spoke about forgiveness and the hard work of rebuilding trust. I talked about the difference between inheriting a legacy and earning one, about the responsibility that comes with being given a second chance. "This little girl will never know the family we were during the worst of it," I said, holding Emma while she slept peacefully in my arms. "She'll only know the family we became afterward, the one that learned to tell the truth even when it hurt, to ask for help even when it felt like weakness, to believe in each other even when belief seemed foolish." That evening, after Marcus and Sarah had taken Emma home to the apartment they were renting in town while saving money for a house, I found myself alone on the back porch where this entire journey had begun. The floorboard was solid now, the hiding place permanently sealed. No more buried secrets, no more desperate attempts to protect each other from painful truths. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the photos I'd taken throughout the day. Emma's tiny fingers wrapped around Marcus's thumb, Sarah's radiant smile as she watched her husband hold their daughter, the 3 of them together in the soft light of the autumn sun. These were the images that would define our family's story going forward, not the bank statements and legal documents that had once seemed so important. The financial cost of saving Marcus had been substantial. The monthly mortgage payments would continue for another 20 years, consuming most of my Social Security income and leaving little room for luxuries. The rental properties that had once provided comfortable passive income were now leveraged to the hilt. The retirement I'd planned, traveling to see distant relatives, maybe buying a small house in town where the upkeep would be easier, had been sacrificed on the altar of unconditional love. But as I sat on that porch, surrounded by the sounds of cattle settling for the night and the distant hum of traffic on the highway, I felt something I hadn't expected: gratitude. Not for the crisis that had nearly destroyed our family, but for the opportunity it had provided to discover what we were actually made of when everything else was stripped away. The year had taught me that legacy isn't about what you leave behind: property or money or material possessions that can be lost or stolen or gambled away. Legacy is about who you raise your children to become, about the values you model when the stakes are highest, about the choice to plant seeds of hope in the scorched earth of broken trust. Marcus's construction business had not only survived but thrived under the new structure of financial transparency and accountability. His relationship with Sarah had emerged stronger from the crisis, built now on genuine honesty, rather than the comfortable illusions that had characterized their early marriage. Most importantly, He'd learned to live with the daily choice between destruction and redemption, understanding that recovery wasn't a destination but a practice. 6 months later, on a warm spring morning, I woke to find Marcus and Sarah in my kitchen, Emma babbling happily in her high chair while they prepared what had become our traditional Sunday breakfast. These weekly gatherings had replaced the awkward holiday visits and obligatory phone calls of years past, creating space for the kind of genuine intimacy that had been missing from our family relationships. "Mom, we have something to tell you," Sarah said, her eyes bright with excitement. My first thought was that she might be pregnant again, though it seemed early for that. Instead, Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope from First National Bank. "The construction business had a really good quarter," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Good enough that we were able to make an extra payment toward the mortgage on the farm." Inside the envelope was a receipt showing a payment substantial enough to reduce my monthly obligations by almost 30%. It wasn't enough to eliminate the debt entirely, but it was a significant step toward financial stability. "Marcus, we can afford it," Sarah interrupted gently. "The business is doing well, we're living within our means, and we want to contribute to cleaning up the mess we made." "The mess I made," Marcus corrected. "And Mom, this isn't charity or guilt, it's responsibility. My daughter is going to inherit this farm someday, and I want her to inherit it free and clear, the way it should have been all along." As I held that receipt, feeling the weight of partial redemption in my hands, I thought about James and the conversations we'd had during the early years of our marriage about the difference between owing someone money and owing them a debt that could never be repaid. My son was learning that distinction, understanding that financial restitution was only the beginning of making amends for the trust that had been broken. Emma chose that moment to throw her sippy cup onto the floor, a gesture that made all three adults laugh and reminded us that life goes on, that joy persists even in the aftermath of betrayal, that children have a remarkable ability to pull their families toward the future rather than dwelling in the mistakes of the past. That afternoon, as I worked in my garden while Emma napped in her portable crib nearby, I reflected on the strange mathematics of loss and gain that had defined the past 18 months. I'd lost most of my financial security, but gained a deeper understanding of what actually mattered. I'd sacrificed the comfortable distance that had characterized my relationship with Marcus, but gained the intimacy that comes from surviving a crisis together. The tomatoes I'd planted that spring were thriving in the Texas heat, their vines heavy with fruit that would feed my growing family through the summer months. There was something satisfying about the predictable cycle of planting and tending and harvesting, about the way investment of time and attention yielded tangible results. As Emma woke from her nap and began the cheerful babbling that had become the soundtrack of our Sunday afternoons, I realized that this moment of simple domestic contentment was what I'd been working toward my entire life. Not the accumulation of wealth or property, but the creation of space where the people I loved could flourish. The buried truth had been uncovered, examined, and ultimately transformed into something that looked surprisingly like wisdom. We'd learned that families can survive almost anything if they're willing to choose love over pride, transparency over comfort, and hope over cynicism. The seeds planted in the scorched earth of broken trust were beginning to bloom into something beautiful and resilient and worthy of the Henderson name. The floorboard on the back porch remained solid, the hiding place beneath it permanently sealed with concrete and intention. But the real foundation of our family, built from forgiveness and accountability, and the daily choice to believe in each other's capacity for redemption, felt stronger than it ever had before. As the sun set over the Texas plains on another ordinary Sunday, painting the sky in familiar shades of orange and pink, I sat on my porch with my granddaughter in my arms and felt the deep satisfaction of a life lived according to values that had proven themselves worthy of the cost they'd demanded. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight I was content to hold this perfect child and know that she would grow up in a family that had learned the difference between being perfect and being honest, between being successful and being whole, between inheriting a legacy and earning the right to carry it forward. The buried truth had set us free. My son called and said, "The farm and properties are in my name now. You're too old to manage them. Everything is mine now. You can keep the old house," and hung up. I just agreed, but when I opened the house door, I discovered something buried.